The night they drove her out, the torches made her shadow long against the courtyard stones. Mira did not run. She had learned, in the years since her mother's death, that running invited pursuit. So she walked, her chin level, her hands steady at her sides, her worn woolen cloak pulled close against the first bite of autumn. While the guards of Ashenmoor Keep flanked her at 3 paces, close enough to catch her if she stumbled, not close enough to touch her. The great gates ground open ahead, iron on stone, and beyond them lay the black mouth of the Thornwood. She did not look back. That was the hardest thing. Not the exile itself, not the cold, not the hunger she already knew was coming, but the refusal to give them the satisfaction of watching her face break. Mira of Ashenmoor, once called the healer's daughter, once called the gentle Luna, by the elder wolves who still remembered her mother, walked through those gates with every nerve in her body screaming to turn and find some final hope in the faces behind her. She did not turn. The gates closed at her back, with a sound like a coffin lid. She was tall for a woman of the Highlands, and striking in the way that certain faces are striking, not because they are soft or immediately pleasing, but because they carry the full range of the person behind them. Wide dark eyes the colour of aged amber, under brows that arched with a severity she had inherited from her father. A jaw that was too strong to be called delicate and too fine to be called plain. A mouth that settled into composure by long habit and warmth by deeper instinct. And so that the 2 states, composure and warmth, were always moving in it, trading places, and the face-watching was never entirely certain which it was seeing. Her dark hair was braided back from her face in 2 plaits she had pinned at the nape of her neck before the tribunal, because she had learned at 14 that her hair loose made people think her young, and at tribunal you could not afford to be thought young. She was 21 years old. She had been tending the sick since she was 7. None of that had mattered in the end. Lord Edwin Croft had been waiting for this moment for 7 years, since the day Mira's father died, a coughing sickness that took him in the first hard frost of her 14th winter. Croft had been circling. He was the pack's high steward, a thin man with a patient, dark calculating face and hands that were always slightly too still, like a cat watching a sparrow. He had smiled at her father's burial. She had been too young and too grief-stricken to understand what that smile meant. She understood it now. The accusation had been simple and unanswerable in its design. A pup from the Fenwick litter had died in the night, a small, sickly thing that the healers had expected to lose, and Croft had stood before the pack's gathered elders and laid the death at Mira's feet. She had been tending the pup. She had mixed the fever broth. That was the last thing it drank. There were witnesses who swore, in clear and steady voices, that she had been seen handling herbs that no healer should possess. The witnesses were Croft's men. The herbs had been placed in her satchel the previous night. None of this was provable. All of it was enough. In the hierarchy of the Ashenmoor pack, the Luna, the alpha's intended mate, the woman chosen to stand at the alpha's side, held a title that was also, when necessary, a target. Ashenmoor had been without a true alpha for 3 years, and the packs east and west were circling. An installed steward with a fractured Luna at his feet was a far easier path to power than an open contest. Mira had understood all of this in the single cold moment between Croft's final accusation and the Elder Council's verdict. The verdict came down in under an hour. Exile, immediate. She had 1 hour to gather what she could carry. She had not bothered to gather anything. She had simply walked out. What she had not expected was Croft himself, appearing at the edge of the courtyard as the guards moved her toward the gate. He had timed this precisely. The moment when the gates were open and the guards were close, and there was no recourse remaining. And the expression on his face was the one she would carry into the Thornwood. A man who had won exactly what he wanted and was not bothering to disguise his satisfaction. He stepped close enough that only she and the nearest guard could hear. "The Thornwood will sort itself," he said quietly. "A woman alone rarely lasts more than a fortnight." Mira met his eyes. She did not answer. She did not flinch, did not appeal, did not cry. She looked at him with an expression that was entirely composed and entirely memorizing, as though cataloguing his face for a record that would eventually be consulted. The guard's hand came down on her shoulder and pushed her forward through the gate. She walked into the dark. The Thornwood closed around her. It was old-growth forest, the kind that grew in the limestone country of the Northern Highlands, where the land remembered things that men had forgotten. The trees were enormous, their canopy so dense that even leafless in autumn, they turned the moonlight to a dim, scattered grey. Mira had gathered herbs here since she was a child, trailing behind her mother with a basket and good boots. She knew these paths the way she knew the lines of her own hands, every fork, every stream crossing, every hollow and overhang. That knowledge was the one thing Croft had not managed to take from her. She found the hollow oak. Before the second hour of walking, a tree she had sheltered in twice during childhood storms, its bark smooth and cold where old rot had settled, and its interior just wide enough to fit a person sitting upright, with her knees drawn up. She cleared the dead leaves with her boot, set her satchel down, and sat in the dark to think. She had 2 days of food, a water skin, medicines enough to treat minor wounds, the cloak on her back. She had not cried yet. She did not think she was going to. The grief was there, solid and real, but it was sitting behind everything else, the way heavy weather sits behind a line of hills, present, waiting, not yet arrived. She had too many calculations still to make. She slept badly and woke before dawn to a sound she did not expect, whimpering. It was a thin, exhausted sound, too small for an adult wolf, barely carrying over the wind. Mira was out of the hollow before she had fully decided to move. Every trained reflex in her body orienting toward it the way a needle orients north. She found them 40 paces off the main path, in a shallow gully choked with old bracken. 3 pups, barely weaned by the look of them, huddled against the body of a she-wolf that had been dead at least 2 days. The cause was clear. A quarrel bolt through the flank, a hunter's shot, or a poacher's. The pups had no mother, and nothing had come back for them. They were cold and shaking, and when Mira crouched at the edge of the gully, the smallest one raised its head and made that thin, heartbreaking sound again. She climbed down. She checked each of them with the systematic efficiency of 7 years of pack healing, cold-stressed, dehydrated, the smallest one running a fever from a cut on its foreleg that had gone untended. She built a small fire with the flint in her satchel, boiled water from her skin, mixed the last of her traveller's broth, and spent the rest of the night coaxing all 3 of them to drink. The smallest one refused for an hour. Then, with the grudging resignation of a creature who has decided that indignity is preferable to death, it drank. By morning, it was sleeping against her thigh, with its nose tucked under her knee. Mira looked down at it. She thought about the road east, which led to the nearest unaligned settlement 40 miles away and would require crossing the Greymarch territory border. She thought about the 2 days of food in her satchel, now 1. Then she looked at the 2 larger pups watching her, with eyes that were enormous and golden and entirely trusting. She stayed. Not because she had decided to, exactly. There was no clean moment of decision. There was simply the fact that she did not leave that morning, and by the time she had dressed the small one's wound and found a better shelter and begun to identify which plants were still yielding edible roots at the edge of autumn, by the time all of that had happened, she had already stayed for a week. After a week, it seemed absurd to leave. After a fortnight, leaving would have meant abandoning something she had no word for yet. She named them. The smallest she called nettle, for the plant that stung and healed in the same breath. The grey female, with a look of patient assessment, entirely at odds with her age, she called Aldwyn. The large dark-coated male, who seemed constitutionally incapable of staying in one place for 30 consecutive seconds, she called Burr. While she found them food out of necessity and learned to be competent about it faster than she would have expected from herself. She dug roots. She set simple snares from bent twigs and cord. She found a stream and followed it to a shallow pool where she could wade in the cold and chase fish into the shallows with her bare hands, which was humiliating and inefficient and, after several failed attempts, eventually productive. She kept herself warm by building small, careful fires, banked, to give heat without much smoke. She kept the pups warm by sleeping curled around them in the bracken, their heat and hers making an economy of warmth that was, on the coldest nights, what made the difference between manageable cold and something else entirely. She did not know she was being watched. It had been 4 days since she was driven from Ashenmoor when Corvin first saw her. He was not supposed to be in the Thornwood. No Alpha King travelled without guard, and Corvin, the Alpha King of the Northern Reaches, ruler of a territory stretching from the limestone highlands to the cold sea, had left his 3 riders a mile east on the road to Ashenmoor. He had told them he needed an hour's solitude and did not specify why. He was 43 years of kingship, housed in a body that appeared 30, with grey eyes that had the quality of eyes accustomed to long distances, and a bearing that had settled into something over the years that did not so much enter rooms as cause them to reorganize. The scar along his left brow, a clean old thing from a border dispute in his 22nd year, had faded to silver. His dark hair was worn short. He was in the way of men who have governed long and paid close attention, precisely as dangerous as he appeared, and somewhat more dangerous than he appeared. And he had learned to keep both of those facts quiet. In the 7 years since the death of his bondmate, a grief so clean and total that it had not softened, but only grown familiar, like a joint that had healed wrong and been lived with so long the ache was simply part of moving. Corvin had found that solitude was the only medicine that reliably worked. He had not expected to find a woman in it. She was crouched at the edge of a stream, her dark braids falling forward over her shoulders, her sleeves pushed to the elbow in the cold air, while she wrapped a strip of linen around the leg of a wolf pup, the approximate size of a large loaf of bread. She was talking to it. He was too far to hear the words. The pup was watching her with the expression of an animal that has decided, against all instinct, to trust something larger than itself. Corvin stood among the trees and watched. He told himself he was assessing the situation. A woman alone in the Thornwood with pack pups of Ashenmoor colouring was a security matter, potentially. He told himself many reasonable things. None of them were entirely true. The truth was closer to this. He had not seen anyone do anything uncalculated in a very long time, and the sight of it had stopped him in a way that was difficult to name and easier to observe. She finished with the leg wrap, tested the tension with 2 careful fingers, a healer's habit, methodical and assured, and sat back on her heels and waited. The pup nosed at the bandage. It had decided it was acceptable and immediately placed its entire body weight against her knee. The woman laughed. It was a soft sound, almost involuntary, like something escaping rather than something offered. Corvin stepped back into the deeper forest and left without announcing himself. He came back the next day, and the day after. He watched her build a fire with the precise, unhurried competence of someone who has done it long enough that thought no longer enters into it. He watched her sing to the grey pup, badly, tuneless, a children's song he vaguely recognized, while applying a poultice to a raw patch on the animal's back. He watched her track a rabbit through the bracken, with something very close to strategy, her feet finding the frost-softened ground quietly, come back empty-handed and unfazed, and reroute to the stream instead. He watched her do all of this, and said nothing, which was not something he was generally accused of. On the 5th day of watching, it rained. The kind of rain that falls in limestone country in late October is not the gentle autumn rain of stories. It comes down like cold iron, without preamble, turning the ground to grey soup and the air to something barely breathable. Corvin watched from beneath a tree, dry in his heavy travelling cloak, as Mira constructed an emergency shelter from fallen branches and bracken with focused, rapid practicality. She herded all 3 pups inside and settled herself at the entrance where she could keep the rain from driving in. The pups arranged themselves against her and went to sleep. Mira did not sleep. She sat at the entrance with her knees drawn up, watching the rain. And for the first time since Corvin had been watching her, her face showed what it actually was. Not grief, exactly. Something quieter. The effort of keeping a weight from setting entirely. The face of someone who has been making a very long series of decisions that required the same controlled expression and has found a moment, briefly, when no one is watching. Corvin moved before he had decided to move. He stepped out from the trees, crossed the glade, and crouched at the entrance to the shelter with his travelling cloak in his hands. The woman went very still. "I am not a threat," he said. He heard how it sounded. A large armed man in a forest saying this, and added, and with something that was almost accuracy, "I have been watching you for 5 days, and have not yet found reason to be one." Her amber eyes catalogued him with rapid, measuring attention, moving from his face to his hands, to the sword at his hip, to his face again. He had been assessed by war councils and rival alphas, and had never felt quite this precisely evaluated. "Your sword," she said. Her voice was level and unhurried. "Remove your hand from the hilt." He had not realized his hand was there. He moved it. She studied him another moment. Then she took the travelling cloak he was holding out and handed it behind her into the shelter. When the smallest pup immediately pulled it into a nest, she turned back with an expression that was not quite a smile. You have been watching me for 5 days, and in 5 days you have not introduced yourself," she said. "That is either very rude or very careful." "Both," said Corvin, and it was honest. "I am Mira," she said. "The Thornwood is my home presently. The pups are Nettle, Aldwyn, and Burr." A pause, brief as a door catching on its threshold. "I know what you are. The ring on your right hand is the Highland seal. There are 3 men on the road, a mile east, who have been trying not to look like they're waiting for someone since this morning." He looked at her for a moment. "I am Corvin," he said, "Alpha King of the Northern Reaches." "I know," said Mira. "Will you tell me why you have been watching me? Or shall I guess?" He brought his riders in from the road. He did not explain the situation. They had been in his service long enough to accept this. He sat at the entrance of the bracken shelter with his back to the woman and the pups, watching the rain for hours, and found, in a way he did not have a tidy accounting for, that the silence at his back felt differently weighted than most silences. He came back in the night to build up the fire. Without being asked, the coals were low. He added wood quietly and settled beside them. He told himself this was necessary because the temperature had dropped and pups needed warmth. He did not examine the reasoning too carefully. Mira woke in the hours before dawn to find Nettle had fever again. She knew it immediately. The too hot press of the small body against her palm, the rapid, shallow breathing. She was moving before she was fully awake, finding her satchel in the dark by feel, measuring herbs by memory, boiling water on the banked coals. She had done this for her mother's patients, for the pack pups in the years when she was still permitted to tend them. The procedure was automatic. Her hands knew what to do before her mind arrived. The coals gave just enough light. She was so focused on the mixture that she did not hear Corvin settle beside her until the coals caught the edge of his shadow. She did not startle. She had heard him without choosing to, and filtered him as not a threat without deciding to, which was new information she filed away without examining yet. "The fever broth," he said quietly, watching her hands. "You know what you're doing. My mother was the Ashenmoor healer before me. I have been mixing this remedy since I was 7. She tested the broth temperature against her inner wrist. "Oh, the pup that died. The Fenwick litter. I know what you're about to ask. What had you actually given it?" he said. "The same broth. A correct dose for a pup that size." She met his eyes across the small fire. The pup was born with a weak heart. Any healer could have told Croft that, if he had ever consulted a healer rather than appointing one whose primary function was political. She offered the broth to Nettle, who sniffed it with the expression of an animal weighing survival against dignity. My mistake, if I made one, was assuming that 7 years of losing no pups was evidence enough to speak for itself. "Someone has been watching you work," Corvin said, "more carefully than you knew." Mira looked up at him. "I sent a rider to Ashenmoor 6 days ago," he said. "Before I encountered you, Shai requested records of your years as pack healer." He held her gaze without wavering. "You have not lost a pup in 7 years." The fire crackled. Nettle, having resolved the internal debate in favor of survival, began to drink. Mira looked down at the pup. Her jaw was set in the controlled way of someone managing a stronger reaction. There was anger there, a warm, low burn. But beneath it, something else entirely. The disorientation of being seen, of someone going looking for the truth of her and coming back with it. "Why?" she asked, and her voice came out less steady than she had intended. "Because Croft's letter was requesting endorsement rather than providing information," Corvin said. "A man who controls the information is not a man who should be asking for royal endorsement. He should already have it or not." He looked at the pups sleeping against her thigh. "I wanted to know what the information actually said." He told her more then. The Ashenmoor situation, the steward governance, the full weight of what was at stake. She listened with the attentive patience of a healer, taking a history, processing, assembling, not reacting until she had enough to react accurately. "I am telling you this," she said finally, "because you should understand what is at stake for you, not for me. I am in a forest with 3 pups, and what happens to Ashenmoor's politics is no longer my concern. But you are about to make a decision that determines the governance of 3,000 wolves, and you should make it with complete information." "I know," Corvin said, "which is why I came." He said it simply. There was nothing in his voice that required her to respond to it in any particular way, which was, she was beginning to understand, very much the way he spoke about things that mattered. "Mira," he said, "I am going to ask you something, and I need you to understand that my asking does not require your agreement, and your refusal will not change what I do about Ashenmoor. Those 2 things are entirely separate." She held his gaze. "The bond right," he said. "The king's right of selection. Ashenmoor needs a Luna. Its rightful Luna. And its people need someone who will tend them the way you have tended these 3. I am asking you to return to Ashenmoor as its Luna. not under Croft's authority, but under mine. As the mate-designated queen of the northern reaches, he did not look away. As I am asking you to come back as my chosen queen and mate. The fire was the only sound for a long moment. You have been here 6 days, she said. Yes. And before that, I read 7 years of healers' records, and the testimony of 3 Ashenmoor elders willing to speak privately, and the account of a stable hand named Garrett, who saw Croft's man enter your quarters the night before the accusation. He paused. I have been working on this for some time. Mira looked at him with the same careful attention she had given everything that mattered. She thought about 3,000 wolves and a steward who understood them only as a resource. She thought about the cloak, offered in the rain, without condition. I will come back to Ashenmoor when Croft is removed from the stewardship, she said. Not before. I will not walk into that keep as anyone's anything while he still holds authority. Croft will be removed before you set foot in the gates, Corvin said. You have my word. Your word is the king's word, she said. Yes, it is. The fire settled. Aldwyn, the grey pup, raised her head, looked at both of them with the expression of a very old judge assessing a pair of new barristers, and went back to sleep. Something in Mira's chest had shifted, in a way she did not have a complete framework for, a warmth that was not the fire's. She filed it under things to be examined when she had more information. The pups come with me, she said. The expression that moved across his face then was brief and unguarded, something between surprise and something older, something that looked, in this firelight, very much like relief. The pups come with you, he agreed. They broke camp in the morning. Corvin's 3 riders were brought in, the saddlebags repacked, and a canvas sling was produced from somewhere. Corvin had it ready, which she chose not to ask about, that allowed all 3 pups to travel in a bundle of limbs and noses across the front of her saddle. She had the distinct suspicion this particular piece of equipment had been planned for, and filed it beside the other things she was accumulating about him. They rode south toward Ashenmoor, with the sun at their backs. The pups slept in the sling, and occasionally attempted to escape from it, which Nettle achieved once before Burr landed on her, and the matter resolved itself. They had covered half the distance to Ashenmoor when the road narrowed through a cut in the limestone ridge, and the ambush came. Croft's men had chosen the location with care. The road barely wide enough for 2 horses abreast, the embankment rising steeply on either side, the limestone bridge behind them cutting off clean retreat. 4 men emerged from the trees at the road's head. Corvin's 3 riders were already moving forward, drawing the 4 away, when Mira saw the 5th, emerging from a gap in the embankment, to her left at a fast walk, heavy-set and purposeful, with the cold expression of a man executing an assignment rather than making a decision. She knew him, Sibbald, Croft's head enforcer, a man who had administered pack discipline for 11 years and had never once required a reason beyond being told. The woman, Sibbald said, to the man at his shoulder. He said it the way one says, bring the lamp. The king can go. He was still speaking when Mira dropped from the saddle. She went off the far side, away from Sibbald, away from the road, and hit the ground already moving, using the horse as a barrier between her and the approaching man, going toward the embankment, because a horse could not easily follow up a steep limestone slope, and a man could not follow her through terrain he didn't know. She heard Sibbald shout. She heard hoofbeats. She was on the slope before the second man reached her position, scrambling up the loose limestone on her hands and knees, fingers scraping the rock, the cold stone biting into her palms, where the skin split on the edge of a shelf. She did not stop. She had climbed this ridge before, in summer, looking for the fellwort that grew in the cracks at the top. She knew where the hawthorn was too dense for a large man to push through without slowing. She went through it at an angle, heard the man behind her hit the thorns at full speed and curse and slow dramatically, and gained the 20 paces she needed. The limestone overhang was where she remembered it, low and jutting, invisible from below. She pressed herself flat beneath it, controlled her breathing the way her mother had taught her to control it, when a patient was panicking, and the healer's stillness was the only anchor available, and listened. The sounds of the fight on the road below resolved quickly. She heard Corvin's voice, not raised, not anxious, carrying with the particular quality of authority that expects to be obeyed rather than pleads to be heard. And then the sounds of struggle diminishing into the specific silence that follows a concluded thing. When she came back down the embankment, her palms were bleeding and her cloak was torn at the shoulder where it had caught on the hawthorn. Sibbald and his men were kneeling in the road with their wrists bound, and Corvin was at the base of the slope when she appeared at the top. He stopped. He looked up at her, her braids half undone, blood on both hands, standing on a limestone ridge in the thin morning light, with her chin at that particular angle she used when she was managing something she would not discuss until later. And for a moment, his face did something that had not been composed in advance. "You ran toward the overhang," he said. "It was the logical choice. There is a gap in the hawthorn that a large man cannot get through cleanly." He held her gaze for a moment without speaking. "Come down," he said, carefully. She came down. His hands came up to steady her at the last step and remained, one at her arm, one at her waist, a beat longer than the steadying required. She noticed. She did not comment. His hands were large and warm and very still. The pups were unharmed. Nettle had slept through the entire incident, which said something about either her temperament or her opinion of human conflict. Sibbald and his men were escorted east by 2 of Corvin's riders toward the Northern Reaches Tribunal. They rode the rest of the way to Ashenmoor without incident, and the whole of that afternoon Mira was aware of Corvin riding close. Not crowding, not hovering, simply positioned, so that if anything came from the tree line to her left, it would have to go through him first. He did not remark upon this. She did not remark upon it. Some things were communicated more efficiently through positioning than through words. What she did not yet know was the full architecture of what he had built. She would learn it 3 days later, standing in the Ashenmoor Great Hall, with the pack assembled and Croft white-faced before the Elder Council. The stable hand. Garrett had been in safety at the King's Holdings for 11 days. The 3 witnesses Croft had used had been interviewed separately, and their accounts had fractured on the 3rd question of each interview. The herbs found in her satchel had been identified by the King's own healer as a variety that did not grow within 40 miles of the Thornwood, and could only have been purchased in the market town to the east, a town Mira had not visited in 4 months, and that Croft's courier had visited 3 days before the accusation. The rider who had delivered the false evidence to the Elder Council had been located and had agreed, with encouragement, to speak plainly. None of this had been assembled after Corvin found her in the forest. All of it had been assembled before. 6 weeks of careful, unreported work since the first whisper of the accusation had reached his court. He had entered the Thornwood not in search of evidence. The evidence was already written and witnessed and sealed, but in search of her, to satisfy himself that the woman the evidence described was the woman who actually existed, to be certain. Because the stakes were 3,000 wolves, and he had learned, in the long years of his kingship, that certainty was the only thing worth leading with. Croft, facing the assembled evidence with no preparation and no escape, and 40 witnesses who had been waiting for exactly this permission, chose retreat over combat and lost both. He was stripped of the stewardship before sundown. He did not leave quietly, but he left. That night, Corvin stood before the pack and named Mira as the mate-designated Luna of the northern reaches. His chosen queen, the mate bond right formally invoked before the council. The king's right of selection spoken plainly in the hearing of every elder and wolf of Ashenmoor. The elders, three of whom had been privately certain of her innocence for a fortnight and deeply ashamed of their public silence, accepted with a unanimity that was somewhat performative and entirely real. Mira stood beside him and felt the assembly's attention settle on her like weight. Not hostile weight, not the weight of the courtyard that had watched her exile, but something she recognized from her mother's time. The specific pressure of 3,000 people deciding whether to trust something. She had grown up watching her mother receive that pressure and absorb it and give it back as steadiness. She stood straight. She kept her chin level. She let them look. The elder named Hessa, an old woman who had bounced Mira on her knee at festival once and had not met her eyes once during the accusation, looked at her from the far end of the hall with an expression that was purely, quietly readable. It said, "I failed you, and I know it." Mira held her gaze until the old woman's shoulders came down. That was not forgiveness. It was a ledger entry, an acknowledgement, something that would need to be worked through over time rather than resolved in a single moment. But it was a beginning. Her mother had taught her that beginnings were not the same as resolutions, and that a healer who confused the two would exhaust herself trying to close things that needed time to heal from the inside. Later, when the hall had emptied and the torches were burning low and the pups, who had been introduced to the assembled wolves of Ashenmoor with a ceremony that Mira suspected would be discussed for years, primarily because Burr had attempted to climb the high steward's chair, were sleeping in a heap in the rushes near the hearth. Corvin found her at the window of the upper corridor, looking out over the courtyard, where the torches had been lit along the walls. He stopped a pace away, giving her room. "I want to ask you something," she said without turning. "And I want an honest answer." "Yes," he said. "When you came to the shelter in the rain," she said, "the morning after. The fever. You sat beside me for an hour." She paused. "You said nothing about the investigation, about the evidence or the witnesses. You just sat there." "Yes," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. The torchlight from the courtyard below moved across the stone floor between them. "Because you were managing a fever and a frightened pup, and your hands were entirely steady," he said. "And I did not want to interrupt the steadiness." A pause, shorter than the others. "And because I had been looking for a reason to sit next to you since the third day, and the fever gave me one." Mira turned from the window. He was looking at her with the direct, unguarded attention she had come to recognize. But something had moved in it, something that had been held at a careful distance before, and was no longer. The expression of a man who has made a very long series of careful decisions, and has arrived at one that he is making with the rest of them set aside. You ruled an entire territory for how long?" she asked. 23 years, he said. "And in 23 years, she said carefully, you have been watching for this, for a reason to sit beside someone." "Yes," he said. It came out very simply. Mira looked at him. She thought about 7 years alone since her father died, about the hollow oak and the cold and the specific calibration required to keep 3 pups alive through October in a northern forest, about the fact that he had not arrived in the Thornwood to rescue her. She had not needed rescuing, not in the end, but to find her, to be certain of her, to give back what had been taken, not as charity, but as what the evidence said she was owed. She reached out and placed her hand over his, which was resting on the stone of the window ledge. And his hand turned over beneath hers, palm up, and was still, the way he had been still at the shelter entrance in the rain, offering without requiring. "I want to be clear," she said quietly, "that I am not agreeing to anything tonight that I will regret in the morning." "I know," he said. "I am not asking. You have a considerable talent for that." "For what?" "For not asking. For making space and waiting for someone to choose to fill it." He was quiet for a moment. "Someone told me once," he said, "that the only thing worth having is what is freely given. I have been taking that seriously for a very long time." Mira looked up at him. The torchlight caught the angles of his face. The hard jaw, the old scar along his left brow, the grey eyes that had been looking at her with careful, unhurried attention for days. She felt something she did not yet have full words for. Not the rush of the overwhelming, not the sweep of the irresistible, but something quieter and more durable. The specific sensation of standing in a doorway and discovering that what is inside the room is exactly what she had stopped hoping to find. "Corvin," she said. "Yes. The pups are going to be extremely territorial about the great hall rushes." He looked at her for a moment. Then something in him eased. A slight, genuine settling. Something that had been held at distance for a long time. Finding it did not have to hold quite so hard anymore. It was not a smile exactly. It had all the same components arranged in a quieter way. "I have managed worse," he said. "I know," she said, and she kept her hand where it was. The months that followed, pass the way months pass, when something has been set right that was long wrong. Not dramatically, not in a single radiant moment, but with the slow accumulating warmth of an ordinary morning that contains slightly more ease than the one before it. Mira took up the Luna's work with the methodical thoroughness she had applied to everything she had ever done, and the 3,000 wolves of Ashenmoor discovered, over the course of those months, what it meant to have a healer in the hall who understood them as patients rather than subjects. She did not forget the exile. She did not pretend the silence of the elders during her trial had not happened. But she understood, the way her mother had, that a healer could not afford to keep the wound open, that tending the pack required her to be steadier than her own grievances, at least in public, at least for now. The private accounting could wait. Corvin was, as it turned out, an extremely inconvenient person to be in proximity to. Not because he was difficult, but because he was exactly as consistent in private as he was in the great hall, which gave her nothing to push against, and which was, she eventually concluded, probably the point. He left books she had mentioned in passing beside her chair in the library. He adjusted his patrol routes without comment. So the outer grounds were clear when she needed to walk them for her own thinking. He remembered, without seeming to make an effort to remember, and every small thing she had told him and acted on it quietly and without announcement. She called him out on this, eventually, because it seemed important that he know she had noticed. "That is the most calculated kindness I have ever encountered," she told him. "In the library, fire between them, a book open in each of their laps. And also the most genuine. I do not know what to do with both of those things being true at the same time." He looked at her over the edge of his book. "Both things are true," he said. "I am not certain they are in conflict. They feel like they should be." "That is because you were taught," he said carefully, "that kindness requires a price, that nothing is given without a ledger behind it. You are still looking for the ledger." She held his gaze. "There is no ledger," he said. "I do not want anything from you that you have not chosen to give." She was quiet for a long moment. "That is possibly the most difficult thing anyone has ever said to me to actually believe," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not in a hurry." Nettle, who had taken to sleeping under the library table, made a sound in her sleep that was either a dream or an editorial. Mira looked down at the pup and back at Corvin, who was watching her with the expression she had first seen in the firelit forest. A man arriving at a conclusion he had been working toward for a considerable time, not pushing it, simply waiting for the evidence to accumulate. She closed her book. "I believe you," she said. Quietly, as though the words were slightly larger than the room and needed to be placed carefully. He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was very steady and very quiet. "I know," he said. "You told me the first time 3 days ago, when you stopped checking whether the library door was open." She stared at him. "You noticed," she said. "I notice everything about you," he said. "I have since the forest. I expect I will continue to." Outside, the first snow of winter was falling on Ashenmoor's courtyard, soft and unhurried. Inside, the fire was warm. Aldwyn had claimed the hearthrug. Burr was on the chair he was not supposed to be on. Nettle was still asleep under the table, having apparently decided that her editorial had been sufficient and further commentary was unnecessary. Mira looked at the man across the fire, at the grey eyes and the steady hands and the 23 years of careful governance behind them. Yea, at the scar along his brow and the dark hair and the way he held himself even here. In the library, with a quiet authority that was not performance, but simply who he was, and felt, without drama or fanfare or the sweep of anything overwhelming, exactly what it felt like to stop waiting and choose instead. She reached across the space between them and took his hand. "I stopped checking the lock," she said. "The second night." He turned his hand over under hers, steady and still and asking nothing. The snow fell on Ashenmoor Keep. The pups slept in the library rushes, and in the great hall below, the torches burned through the night for the first time in 3 years. All of them, every sconce, every bracket along the old stone walls. Because the pack of Ashenmoor had learned, in the long months of uncertain stewardship and the longer years of waiting, what it meant to finally have something worth lighting the hall for,